Well, we're in the third week of our sermon series called Dream On, looking at dreams and dreamers in the Bible. And our goal in doing this is to help us to see how that can help us pursue our dreams for ourselves and for the church. Today we look at the story of Gideon. Now at this time, Israel was under the control of a nation called Midian. That's why they're called the Midianites. That's the people who lived in Midian. And God chose Gideon. This is going to be confusing, Gideon and Midian. But God chose Gideon to be the one to help lead Israel to fight the people of Midian, the Midianites, drive them out of Israel. Now Gideon was kind of skeptical about this at first, as a lot of the people whom God calls are. He put God to a couple of tests to make sure he had the story right. And then he's finally convinced. He gets an army together. He's going to go fight the Midianites. And that's where our reading for today picked up the story. Gideon and his army are ready to go and fight. God says, no, wait a minute. This is not going to work. Don't want you to do it this way. You've got too many people. If you win with this big of an army, you're going to think you guys did it yourselves instead of realizing that I did it. So God tells Gideon to send some of them home. Specifically, God says Gideon should tell his army, anyone who's scared should leave. And they do. Over 2/3 of them leave. Gideon's army, which started out with 32,000 men, is all of a sudden down to 10,000. So once again, Gideon and what's left of his army are ready to go. They're going to go fight the Midianites. And God again says, no, wait a minute. This is still not going to work. You've still got too many people. You're still going to think you won this battle yourselves if I let you go with this big of an army. God tells Gideon to go take the army down to the water to drink. Anyone who scooped up the water in their hands would stay back. Only those who lapped the water with their tongues would go and fight. Now, I don't know, as I think about that, I think if I was to go get a drink of water from a river or a creek or a lake or something, I don't think it would occur to me to just kneel down and lap up the water with my tongue. And it apparently did not occur to very many of Gideon's army either. Because out of the 10,000 men in Gideon's army, about 3%, lapped up the water with their tongues. God told Gideon, take those 300 men, go beat the Midianites with them. Now imagine how Gideon felt at this point. He'd started out with this huge army. Now he was down to this little band of warriors. He was kind of scared. So God sent Gideon and his servant down to the Midianite camp. Just as Gideon gets there, overhears one Midianite telling another about this dream that he's had. And the dream is one that says God is going to give Gideon victory over the Midianites. And of course, that's exactly what happens. So what do we learn from this dream? And for that matter, what do we learn from this whole story? We've talked in previous weeks about how what we're looking for here is not our personal dreams or our own dreams for the church. What we're looking for is God's dream. God's dream for ourselves, God's dream for our church. But when we find God's dream, we need to let that dream be fulfilled in God's way. We'll have a role to play in it, of course. But we need to play that role in God's way and at God's time. And a lot of times, God's way and God's time are quite a bit different from what we think the way and the time ought to be. Gideon thought the way to go follow God's dream, that the best way to defeat the Midianites would be to build the biggest army that he could get. And to you and me, that'd make perfect sense, right? I'm not promoting going to war, but if we decide that we have to do it, I think we'd all want to have the biggest and best military force we could possibly have, right? We'd want to go in there with overwhelming force if we could. We'd want to go in with shock and awe. We'd want to just overwhelm the opposition if we could. That's what Gideon wanted to do. But it's not what God wanted. God wanted Gideon and all these people to know who was going to be responsible for this dream coming true. And it was not going to be Gideon. And it was not going to be the people of Israel. And it was not going to be the army. It was God. They would defeat the Midianites because of what God did. And not because of what they themselves did. And I think that's an important lesson for us. You ever noticed how quick we tend to be to blame God when something goes wrong, and how quick we are to either take it for granted or take the credit for it ourselves when something goes right? I do that all the time too. When there's a tragedy, when there's a disaster, when things go wrong that don't seem to be our fault, what do we always hear? Why would God let something like that happen? When things go well, when we get a good break that we did not deserve, when things are going really good and we did not do anything to make that happen, how often do we say, why would God do that for me? Probably not very often, certainly not as often as we should. I'm guessing that for every person here, God has given us all kinds of good breaks that we did not deserve. I'll just take a few from my own life. For one thing, I was born in the United States of America. That's a pretty good break right there when you think about it. I was born in rural South Dakota, as many of you were, I expect. I think that's a huge break. I think that's a wonderful place to have been born and to live. I was born into a family that was not rich, but was certainly not impoverished either. Never had a day where I was worrying about having enough to eat that day, or was worrying about whether I'd have a warm place to sleep that night. And I suspect that's true of most of us too. I was born into a loving family. And some of you may not have been, I understand that, but I suspect many of us were. I was not born with any physical or mental impairment. And again, that may not be true of everyone, but I'm sure it was true of most of us. That's just the very beginning of the list of good breaks that God has given to me. Now, I had nothing to do with any of them. I did not cause them. I did not earn them. I did nothing to deserve them. Most of us here have probably had an awful lot of good breaks from God. Things that we did nothing to earn or deserve or cause. Of course, we've had a lot more throughout our whole lives. We have those. Really, when you think of it, pretty much everything positive that we've accomplished is a result of good breaks that we've gotten from God. And yet most of the time, we don't even think about that. We might pay lip service to it. Maybe once in a while at least. But most of the time we tend to give ourselves the credit, don't we? I do a lot of times. You know, someone gives me a compliment, I don't usually respond by giving God the credit. I don't know a lot of people who do. We'll give God the blame when things go wrong. We're really quick to do that. But we want to credit ourselves when things go right. It's a rare thing, and in fact, it's probably an impossible thing for us to make God's dreams come true by our own efforts. Now again, we have a role to play. Gideon did. Gideon did eventually go and attack the Midianite camp, just the way God told him to with his 300 men. But everyone knew there was no way that 300 guys on their own could defeat this entire huge Midianite army, an army that had so many camels that they could not even be counted, that they were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. No way 300 guys could defeat that kind of an army. They knew that Gideon and the people of Israel had won because God was with them. And that's how we will achieve God's dreams for ourselves and for our church. We'll achieve them because God is with us. Or we won't achieve them because we'll try to do it all ourselves. Again, we have a role to play. I'm not saying that. But we're not going to accomplish God's dreams for ourselves and for our church by our own greatness, any more than Gideon could have overwhelmed the Midianite army with 300 men. We'll only accomplish these things in God's time and in God's way. And you know, there's one other thing to note about this story. We talked last week in the story of Joseph about not being afraid to dream a big dream if it comes from God. The thing is, a certain amount of fear in this situation is normal. It's how we respond to that fear that makes a difference. Who were the first people to leave Gideon's army? The ones who were scared. The ones who were afraid. They were afraid that things were going to go wrong, that they could not do this. And you know, notice, God does not criticize those people, and neither does Gideon. Nobody says that those people who left because they were afraid, nobody says that they disobeyed God. Nobody says that they lacked faith. Nobody says anything critical about them at all. What they felt seems to be accepted as pretty normal, as a pretty natural thing to feel in that situation. But while neither God nor Gideon criticized those people, they did go on ahead without them. You see, Gideon was scared too. He was especially scared when God cut the army down to 300. And that's why God sent him to the Midianite camp. Gave the Midianite that dream that said Gideon was going to win. Gideon was afraid, but he still trusted God. Gideon did not let his fear keep him from following God and doing what he was supposed to do to make God's dream come true. He did not let the other people who were afraid keep him from following God and doing what he was supposed to do to make God's dream come true. And neither should we. God has a dream for you. God has a dream for me. God has a dream for this church. And those dreams are going to come true in God's way and in God's time. And they'll come true because God made them come true. We'll have a role to play, but if we force it, if we try to do things our own way in our own time, it won't work. If we just trust God, do our best, let God handle the rest of it, we will see some incredible things happen. And when they do, we will know, just like Gideon knew, just like everybody's going to know, that all the credit for these incredible things goes to God. Amen.